Managing Memories, Museums and Memorials. This is an image of the Imperial War Museum that was founded in 1917 and moved to its present location in 1936. And the present location had previously been a place for the mentally ill. You might be familiar with it, named Bedlam. And it seems very fitting that a museum that originally was dedicated to World War I was located in what is essentially was an asylum, lunatic asylum. So history again is full of many ironies, and we'll be looking at museums and memorials and the whole question of history wars, which is a part of culture wars, and about public history and its presentation. As we've already seen from the readings, that there are many controversies in terms of how to present history to the public. What kind of history should it be? What are the political agendas behind the choices made in terms of what the public will learn or see? And there are many offended constituencies also in terms of the public, those that feel they're left out of that story, those that feel like they're been slighted, or that the full story has not been told. And as we've already seen in some of our readings, what happens when the controversy gets too hot is that then frequently what people will do is just sort of sanitize exhibits and strip it of historical context in terms of trying not to offend important constituencies. And so without historical context, you want to think about how meaningful are many of these memorials or museum exhibits. And it again raises the question of who owns history, who decides what will be presented to the public. And we have already had some readings on this and will continue to have readings. I want to look at a couple of specific examples of this question of public history and who owns history. I want to look at the British Museum and the question of the Parthenon sculptures, the historians' battle against Disney's attempt to create a park very close to Civil War battlefield, and the Enola Gay exhibit, which you've also read previously on. And of course, there's many, many more. So the British Museum, established in 1753, is one of the world's largest and most important museums. And it's a great museum. I love museums, and this is one of my favorite museums. So the Rosetta Stone is one of its many treasures, and it really is incredible. And there is, in your readings, the way, the evidence, the layout of the British Museum, which I think really is interesting in terms of having you think about just how the museum is laid out represents a certain mindset, a certain story that is told. And so when you go into a museum, think about how it's organized, just in terms of the rooms and what floors, what exhibits are on. And decisions are made that determine what will be privileged and what will be deemed less significant in a museum. And oftentimes in many of the great museums of Europe and also in the United States, you can see the legacies of imperialism and how these legacies of imperialism led to people making choices, sort of weighing the values of culture and what would be considered more valuable, more civilized in the presentation of these artifacts. It raises the question of who should be the custodians of the treasures of the past. And this brings us to one of the big controversies, the Elgin marbles issue. And in short, in the beginning of the 19th century, during the Napoleonic War, the 7th Earl of Elgin removed, or perhaps you would say stole, the marble sculptures from the Parthenon. And in 1816, the British Museum acquired them by the Act of Parliament. And successive Greek governments have been trying to get the Parthenon marbles back because the Greek governments have consistently argued that these incredible, priceless treasures of ancient Greece are part of the country's cultural heritage. The British Museum calls itself a universal museum and claims that it is a much better caretaker of world sculptures, and so the Elgin marbles should be in the British Museum where they can be cared for better. So that's one way to look at it. Or another way to look at it is that it's 19th century imperialism dressed up in 21st century globalism. And you can go online and read about this, and it's very interesting, and it raises the issue of cultural property in museums. Who or what country has the right to cultural artifacts? And throughout the many centuries of world history, there has been a tremendous amount of looting of art and of cultural treasures. And so, what's the distinction between looting versus preserving? And what happens to these lost treasures during the war times? Do they get returned? Do they stay in basements or attics? And so it raises questions of sort of this shared heritage versus the rightful home of an artifact. And where should these historical treasures be? The British Museum's position has been that the Parthenon sculptures are best maintained where they are. And you can see the website for more of this. And then you can also go and look at the Greek website and see what the Greek governments argue. The Greek governments built a new Acropolis Museum in Athens to try and get the marbles back, but the British Museum will not move the marbles. Another example of sort of public history and the ownership of history is Disney's America and the clash of a corporation and historians. And in the early 1990s, the Walt Disney Company, which is a very big, muscular company, planned to build a theme park dedicated to the history of the U.S. a few miles away from a very famous Civil War site, the Battle of Manassas, or also sometimes known as the Battle of Bull Run in Virginia. And there was opposition from citizens groups, environmentalists, and historians, and ultimately the project was canceled in 1994. And it raises also interesting questions about the balance between historical authenticity versus entertainment, the role of historians in historical preservation versus development. And I'm not going to go through these various themed areas that were going to be developed, but you should spend some time and read what Disney had planned to create as its celebration of American culture in its various 9 themed areas. And sort of this very much a hyper-reality history with its Crossroads USA, Civil War era village, and the Native American village, and the Civil War fort, and the Ellis Island building, and this idea then of creating the past, what the American past looked like. A mock factory town, and it just looks amazing. So you need to read this and see what you think of it. Well, the historians didn't think much of it, and they protested. And surprisingly enough, historians actually won this round. And this is an article from September 29th, 1994. Disney drops plan for history theme park in Virginia. And Walt Disney Company decided that it would bow to a torrent of criticism, in part because they feared that it would delay the project, is what they argued. But it was clear that there was fervent opposition from some historians, and the American Historical Association was one of the leads on this. And the American Historical Association and environmentalists teamed up together to argue that these Civil War sites were important cultural heritages of the United States and its cultural memory, collective memory, and should not be imperiled by this theme park. And this was a cartoon then that was published about the Disney America History theme park. It kind of sums up this as a criticism of also historians in terms of how to Disneyfy really difficult aspects of American history. So you might want to just kind of consider historians and their public role and their public duty. And this again raises the very thorny issue of the Enola Gay controversy that we've also already read about. And the Enola Gay controversy, if you remember, was about what the context would be in terms of the Enola Gay, that the Smithsonian exhibit was going to look at the last months of the war in the Pacific, including the use of the atomic bomb, and had planned to show the Enola Gay in sort of its context. And veterans groups and politicians stepped in, and things got ugly quickly. And the museum director comes under attack, historians come under attack, the American Legion calls for the cancellation of the exhibit, claims the U.S. is portrayed as the aggressor, veterans are critical, the elite revisionist historians. It's a very interesting contrast to our readings about the Japanese presentation of World War II also, that Americans very much were a mirror image of the Japanese in terms of the Enola Gay controversy. Well, what are the questions that can be raised, whether it is in terms of Japanese presentation of World War II or the United States, is really how long before the public is ready to deal with a painful past, with a traumatic episode. The Enola Gay exhibit was scaled back, it was stripped of complexities and context. This should sound familiar from some of your other reading. And the Smithsonian secretary sort of sums up the retraction of it all when he said, "We made a basic error in attempting to couple a historical treatment of the use of atomic weapons with the 50th anniversary commemoration of the end of the war." So you can't necessarily combine an anniversary with a authentic, deep historical reflection of something. And oftentimes memory trumps history then for public history. Again, the American Historical Association was very active concerning the Enola Gay exhibit. You can go online and see what the American Historical Association said in terms of their protesting of the new Enola Gay exhibit. Go onto their website. And also there's a very lengthy and excellent digital archive in the website is given here in Lehigh University. Also another very good book to read about it is Linenthal and Eaglehart's History Wars. And so ultimately, the Enola Gay is stripped of really any of its context, and you want to think about how important is context in understanding history. The lessons from the history wars: Americans like to think that they are capable of looking at their own history soberly, that they have avoided the snares of trivializing, sanitizing, and sanctifying the past into which other nations have fallen. Our own recent history wars, however, reveal otherwise. And so we are very much like anybody else in terms of what we want to remember. And another heated public controversy is something you're reading about, the Vietnam War Memorial. This passage is in your readings in terms of, initially there was an incredible resounding criticism of the design by Maya Lind for the Vietnam War Memorial, that its objection was based on that it was a clear political message, that it was black, not white, that it had individual names, that it was underground, and the list goes on and on, why this was deemed as just an affront. And so Marita Sturken talks about then collective memory, and that the forms remembrance takes indicate the status of memory within a given culture. And this is something I want you to think about when you are looking at public memory and memorials in museums. That public commemoration is a form of history making, yet it can also be a contested form of remembrance in which cultural memories slide through and into each other, merging and then disengaging into a tangle of narratives. And ironically enough, of course, the wall becomes one of the most beloved memorials, one of the most beloved pilgrimages for people to go to in Washington, D.C. And it is a memorial that is very much alive, that has relevance. And so it is one of those great ironies of history. Again, history loves ironies, that it is one of the favorite monuments for Vietnam vets. So in closing, think about how we are tourists of history and what that means. And Marita Sturken's Tourists of History, Memory, Kitchen, Consumerism from Oklahoma City to Ground Zero is a wonderful book to look at that. And ultimately she argues that the public wants a comfortable telling of the past, does not want to wrestle with negative aspects of the past, its meaning and significance. We want to buy those snow globes, don't we? And I love them.